Hello and most welcome to 1061 of the Heidegger series. Nice, beautiful flowers here. They are definitely pharmacon as well. In a very good sense and a very bad sense. Eat a couple of these flowers and you're bound for death. But the portion of this is saving millions of lives. Have saved millions of lives. This is the digitalis, both poison and life. I had a relative who survived on this digitalis. Just a drop under your tongue. No, that was nitroglycerin. I think it was a pill, but it helped with the heart. And I think that goes for everything we imbibe, eat, and also think. A little too much spoils everything, and that also goes with different things in thinking, in mind, in what we do. And I've started to have some hope here that this Richard Capobianco, the author who's very good at Heidegger, renowned as interpreter of Heidegger, he seems very promising. Let's have another look at another book, Engaging Heidegger, from 2010, published by the University of Toronto Press. And I will try to look at first what makes him unique, going from the big things to the small. I know that's the traditional way of doing it, but since I'm a bit tired today, I will do it that way. Might solve itself anyway. But his uniqueness is what interested me, his unique touch. Capobianco is has a very solid founding in Heidegger's text, and he has a thorough command of all the literature of Heidegger. And the work, according to Capobianco, has dual thesis. One, that the fundamental of thought remains the same for Heidegger through all phases of his work. That is, the question of what being itself is contrasted with the structure and characteristics of beings. And two, that Heidegger's views on the human existential and phenomenological significance of this question did undergo significant changes all the same. In both these, Capobianco is delivering challenges to views widely held by prominent Heidegger experts. I'm not an expert, but including me. And he does so with an impeccable scholarship and remarkable lucidity and simplicity, qualities rare in writing on this philosopher. And oddly enough, this book is supposedly turning to people with very little or none Heidegger cognoscenti, which is quite unusual when it comes to the area. He is forbiddingly difficult, and it doesn't concern itself with narrowly technical matters. It seeks to convey what Heidegger means and why it's important in terms that are broad as well as carefully expounded. The book will have Heidegger scholars at its primary readership, but it will also attract the attention of and can be quite helpful readers for whom Heidegger is an intriguing but rather baffling or even forbidding figure, and about whom they want to have a better grasp. This second group would include bright level or advanced philosophy students as well as teachers and scholars, whose primary interest is not Heidegger and who are not necessarily in philosophy. So what is so novel by Capobianco's treatment of Heidegger? Capobianco argues that Heidegger always had the same fundamental phenomenon in view, which the Greek first espied. Being as the appearing of beings in their beingness. It is shown that several central themed terms of Heidegger's writing have the same meaning as being, sein, in particular two terms which are quite difficult to translate. Ereignis, which is event, appropriation, or event of appropriation. And Lichtung, lighting, clearing. These terms are carefully related to a cluster of conceptions that belong These terms are carefully related to a cluster of conceptions that belong to the account of being, unconcealing of beings, emerging of beings, presencing of beings, freeing of beings, giving of beings, etc. In this area, Capobianco breaks new ground. With respect to Ereignis, he shows that this term, which comes to prominence in Heidegger's middle period, does not involve a break with the reflection on being. He offers another, more subtle account in his close examination of the history of Heidegger's use of Lichtung, which becomes central to Heidegger's writing only in the 1960s. Capobianco especially notes that the third term has received scant scholarly attention. Capobianco documents a shift in the term's connotations from lighting to clearing, which shifts correspond to Heidegger's distancing his reflection on being from the Platonic Augustinian metaphysics of illumination, to which his early and middle periods is still kindred. This is the part of Capobianco's study which one can learn the most. By itself it would justify reading the book. Once again, I'd say the author argues that Heidegger's thought did not move away from its constant focus on being, but that the reflection underwent a shift, one toward emphasizing the negative elusive character of being as the ground of appearing. There is also a look toward being and how Heidegger moves in his development from a stress on human unsettledness toward a stress on human being at home, heimlich. There is especially interesting discussion on Hölderlin's Ishtar, and it's very thoughtful and interesting. I just looked a little into that. His move from the centrality of the mood of anxiety, angst, to that of awe and astonishment the relation of Heidegger's approach to art, especially architecture, as center dwelling in the richness of place, to the self-centeredness of modernists and the decentredness of postmodernist discourses on architecture. Capobianco's description of how Heidegger is decentering centering is valuable, and Heidegger, as well as Lacan, interprets Greek tragedy who affirm human finitude even as they are critics of Greek, especially Aristotelian notions of prudence and measure. There is also some mentioning, which I think very interesting, on Heidegger's affinity for East Asian thought. There are new perspectives in the book on Ikere. There was a turning, according to Capobianco, one moving from concentration on human existence, Dasein, as the site of the disclosure of being, to the concealing disclosure of being itself, to the human. He offers detailed accounts about shifts in language and in existential themes involved in his turning. Such can only be seen here. According to Capobianco, Heidegger maintains that, take a pause here. Capobianco in chapter 3 observes that in important writings of the 1920s and the 1930s, Heidegger maintains that the Dasein is primordially unheimlich and unheimisch, which is not the same thing. Noting that Heidegger often plays on the literal sense of not at home in unheimlich, and he prefers the translation unsettled or unsettledness for unheimlich and Unheimlichkeit. To the more common uncanny or uncanniness. The 1925 lecture course Prologomena to the History of Time establishes a tie between unsettledness and anxiety, unheimlich and Angst, in the phenomenological analysis of Dasein's being in the world that anticipates division 1 of being in time. Fear as the feeling of being threatened by something definite in the environment is distinguished from anxiety, in which what threatens us is nothing definite nor worldly. One has the experience of feeling profoundly unsettled as one no longer feels at home in one's most familiar environment and the environment closest to one. Dasein is anxiousness about nothing in the world, but about being in the world as such. The transformation of being in the world into non-at-homeness is indeed the fundamental phenomena of Dasein, although Dasein clings to familiar modes of being at home in flight from unsettledness. Thus Dasein lets itself be determined for the most part from the world in terms of worldly beings. Similarly, in Being and Time describes how Dasein characteristically flees from its condition into the at-homeness, Zuhause, of the public world. From the 1935 lecture, he no longer privileges angst, but do reprise the theme of Dasein's not-at-homeness, especially in the context of his remarkable commentary on the first choral ode of Sophocles' Antigone, where Heidegger translates Sophocles' Denon as unheimlich. The authentic human accepts, like Antigone, that he or she is without a home in being. Dasein is the happening of unsettledness itself. The chorus's final note, however, is disapproval of the unsettled and daring ones who upset the familiar and customary, whereby the chorus, in a way that Heidegger calls not surprising, takes the stance of the average everydayness of inauthentic Dasein. And then he goes to striking change in approach. There is really a turn here in the mid part of the book, and it's Heidegger's 1942 commentary on Hödland's hymn Der Richter, in which Heidegger's thought turns toward home and the view that Dasein is profoundly home in being. Heidegger now interprets Sophocles' ode as saying that human beings are, in a singular sense, not at home, and that their care is to become at home. Antigone, who takes upon herself the Denon, the unsettledness, at the same time exemplifies that which preserves and is most intimately belonging to the homely. We must think beyond the Denon, in the direction of the homely, the hearth. Not being at home is now associated with forgetfulness of being, thoughtful remembrance, andenken of being as home, completes a journey through foreign lands, through a forgetful unsettledness among beings. One wonders, thus, wandering through foreign lands in 1942 harbor an echo of the very unsettled and unsettling dispersal of German armies far from the homeland. The author finds this commentary compelling for its counterplay between the existential truths of being unsettled and returning to home. It shows admirable complexity in holding that Dasein experience decentering amidst the they-self as a necessary passage to recentering, the return of being at home. This depth and subtlety of unsettledness and being at home are not sustained in Heidegger's work of the 1950s and 60s. Heidegger further characterizes the unheimlich as the contemporary domination of the world by calculative thinking, the thoughtlessness of contemporary man, rather than the faith of Dasein as such. Releasement toward things and openness to the mystery of being offers the prospect of a new rootedness, a dwelling at home with being. Unhomeliness is the defining feature of modern age that can be overcome by restoring a primordial relation to the origin, to the Sein. Through meditative thinking, everything is gladdened everything becomes clear and transparent. The author finds this stance flat compared to the account on human duality in Ishtar commentary, for in that early writing the joy of homecoming is tempered with the reminder that the mourning pervades the Ishtar. It pervades the poet himself in his poetic essence. It is instructive to put another line of the author's criticism next to this one, as he uncovers another limitation of the analysis of Dasein in the 1935 Introduction to Metaphysics. Reading on Antigone, Heidegger's interpretation shares with that of the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, a concern with compelling modern man to come to terms with finitude, while at the same time both interpreters are uneasy with the traditional understanding that the ancient Greek notion for limit and measure, sophrosyne, is at the core of the message. Sorry about that. It seemed to be a little bit hard to reach peace and quiet these days. Well, I'll continue here. Just a sec. I have to add that is usually a very quiet place. I don't know what happened today here. Seems that the forces of the universe are against me. Reading of Antigone was the 1935 Introduction to Metaphysics lectures and his analysis of Dasein. Heidegger's interpretation shares with that of the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, a concern with compelling modern man to come to terms with finitude. Is that even true? While at the same time both interpreters are uneasy with the traditional understanding that the ancient Greek notions for limit and measure, sophrosyne, is at the core of the message about human existence. They share an enthusiasm for Antigone as the heroic transgressor of convention and custom, and such transgression is a necessary condition for authentic selfhood and creativity. In this regard, Heidegger's thought was clearly influenced by German Romantic thinking, and especially Nietzsche's Dionysian critique of the Greek tradition of sophrosyne in The Birth of Tragedy. Antigone exemplifies Dasein standing out in a polemos to confront being as the awe-inspiring, overpowering. Her disaster as a creative force affirms Dasein's greatness, as indeed all creators through their striving become apolis, without city and place, lonely, strange and alien, without statute and limit, something I discussed earlier on here. That how we become unlocated. Apolis was a name I would stick to. I really like that one. The author notes that Heidegger conspicuously passes over the passages which would suggest that not just Creon, but Antigone too, is flawed by excess and lacking measure, balance and perspective, the life wisdom that is ingredient to a living, complete and happy life. Against the reading of Heidegger and Lacan, and thereby including Nietzsche, Capobianco, the author, maintains that the meaning of the tragedies is very much in the keeping with the message of the ancient Greek philosophical tradition. Measure, wisdom, sophrosine, and phronesis is the best of all our wealth. On the other side, there is an adding in spite of the romantic twist of Heidegger's thought, the ethics of authenticity may celebrate an ethics of transgression, but in the end this is not a transgression of finitude, not a transcendence of a radically finite existence. Antigone manifests nobility in the choice and embrace of death, for the resolute acceptance of this limit is the condition of the possibility of a living authentically. So the authentic living is the goal, not sort of a constant point of living. A constant position always undermines itself. That's the nullification of Rudolf Gash, but it's also the sameness in repetition. Capobianco's two criticisms taken together seem to imply that Heidegger's move away in later writings from the Nietzschean conception of authenticity as a heroic transgression remains faithful to affirming the limit of mortality. I can't even believe this lecture. I'm very sorry. Seems that I spent my luck on other things this day. Police beats, alarms, nothing is missing. Maybe this is what makes for strength. Maybe this in itself is an illustration of Capobianco, that standing stern is to do with letting these things come in instead of locking oneself, and the locking in itself makes for fluctuations and, I would say, wave-like structure of everything that goes in one direction and then in another. Well, here the author had two criticisms. Taken together seem to imply that Heidegger's move away from the later, I just said that, as being at home in the later writing involves a turning away from unsettledness as the primordial phenomena of Dasein, as heroic estrangement is no longer the most authentic condition. The concern with finitude is not abandoned. At least in the Ishtar commentary, the turn to home retains a sense of human life as shadowed by mortality, but also in the writing of 1950s, even with a new tone of gladness. The humans as mortals are set apart from the gods in the fourfold, thus gefilt. The question then arises, does the affirmation of mortality fail to save the later account from the flatness with which the author reproaches it? Is it possible that the account of finitude in terms of accepting mortality is not a sufficient approach to the phenomena and cannot prevent the fall from complexity into flatness? One could say here, a point to say that a criticism of Heidegger's approach to finitude is not something proposed by the author. One could rather say that there is a single-minded focus of Dasein to time, history and mortality, And Heidegger does not address the finitude inherent in human existence as moral and political. Thus, releasement to things in the later work is not truly a recovery of classical Sifrosyne, for it does not reflect on measure and phronesis as requirements of thought and action in relations between humans. The turn to being through meditative relations to things supersede all other considerations. The rootedness in the ancestral home, or Heimat, is not really a rootedness in a city, in a sphere of deliberation and action, but merely in the passive setting for the restored relation to being. Indeed, the fellow citizens of this dwelling appear, if they appear at all, as inert fixtures in a pastoral tableau, like the jug, the wine, the plough, the homely things that provide the site for being's disclosure. In some, one is compelled to wonder whether the absence of thoughts about the political conditions for human beings at home does not signify, in its way, a lack of restraint and of measure, one that compromises possibly Heidegger's meditation, undeniable, profound, on the overcoming of thoughtlessness of the technological world. And once again, of course, Capobianco is pointing to this flatness and the technological world, and I would say the technological mode of understanding. And that mode is very hard to understand. We are so used to it because it's everywhere. And I pointed out in the previous lecture, 1060, that it too has its purpose. It's very functional when it comes to construct things, but that's such a limited part of human existence. We have all the other degrees of freedom to do things. It could be that only 1% is in that way technologically conscious, but the other 359 degrees of the circle are not covered, and thereby leaving us unattended, undirected, and not at home. And if that is not unheimlich, I don't know. We are indeed with that very limited measure of knowledge that technological thinking, as I like to call it, brings to us. And those limitations are not to be seen as limitations of thinking itself, but the products of thinking, the products of our being. We do not reach into reality, and therefore we are not able to infuse our lives with knowledge and thereby getting predictive power. That is success, that our goals are fulfilled, and so forth. Therein lies the problem. It's in the flexible way of human beings. And we try to fix that with a sort of thinking. If I put in nicer thinking in my head, or I change my ideology or so forth, I would change something. And Heidegger, I think, is pointing out that doesn't make sense, because you need to change the modus of thinking. That will change the action, and that will change the outcome. So it's in the dynamics, not the static take, what you really believe. And don't you so often hear that in common day discussions? If you say something negative, it's going to rain tomorrow, they say, don't think like that. I would say that don't bring happiness. Much more important, and not even comparable in height and width and breadth and bigness, is of course that your thinking actually has an effect, not if it happens to be at the instance negative or positive. Of course, positive is to prefer, but there are other aspects to thinking, and this is how they succeed. And the static thinking or representation we live in. Sorry, I just want to have to change emblem. There goes my concentration. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.